There are 4 blue plaques on our city's most famous medieval street, the charming cobbled Elm Hill. One of the most famous buildings in Norwich and one of only 6 thatched buildings remaining in the city is the Britain's Arms.
On the 25th of March 1507, a disastrous fire broke out from Tombland in the east to St Giles in the west, burning for around 4 days. Around 700 houses were destroyed, some of which were not rebuilt for many years.
Yet the Britain's Arms survived. Why? Because it stood in the churchyard of St Peter Hungate, apart from the other buildings, so it wasn't damaged. It's also a unique survival in England of a beguinage. This was the home of a small group of single women who devoted themselves to a life of prayer and charitable work within the community. Such institutions were very common on the continent in the Middle Ages, but Norwich is the only English city where there is definite evidence of informal female communities following a religious vow. The building later became a public house known as the Britain's Arms, changing to the King's Arms at the start of the 19th century and reverting again to its old name, where it remained a public house until 1941, when it was closed by the brewers Steward and Patterson. Since the 1980s, it's been a cafe. Onto a building further down Elm Hill that was built after the fire by Augustine Steward, 3 times mayor and also sheriff of Norwich, a man who redeveloped several of the properties on the street and indeed purchased St Andrew's Hall and Blackfriars Hall for the city.
It's on the site of the 15th century home of the Paston family, whose times and tribulations are recorded in the correspondence between John Paston and his wife Margaret.
It has had a variety of occupiers. As well as merchant Augustine Steward, it has been the home of Dr. Gaston Martineau, who moved his Huguenot family here around 1711 to avoid religious persecution in France. By the start of the 20th century, it was a furniture store, when the whole area was deemed a slum, saved from demolition in 1925 by the casting vote of the mayor, when the Corporation of Norwich, or City Council as we call it now, voted 6-5 to restore this whole street to its former beauty. It is now the home of the Strangers Club, and has been since 1927, a mixture of 16th and century construction with the delightful windows and brickwork at the front, the interior beams and the ancient fireplace beside the snooker table. Further down Elm Hill and the 3rd blue plaque is at Wright's Court. As Norwich expanded during the 19th century and its population tripled, the city's courts and yards became home to thousands of people. As the wealthy merchants moved out, their properties were subdivided and their gardens were built upon. In the 1880s, Elm Hill had 7 courts, all accessed by narrow alleyways. Close by were the workplaces, including 3 shoe factories and a dye works. And finally, number 41 to 43 Elm Hill, known as Pettus House. John Pettus was a cloth merchant, a wealthy man who owned land in Norwich, Norfolk and North Suffolk. He was later knighted and held the offices of Sheriff and Mayor of Norwich and represented the city in Parliament in 1601. He is buried at nearby St Simon and St Jude, commemorated by this elaborate alabaster monument erected by his son Thomas. Rebuilt after the fire by Augustine Steward, the Pettus family occupied the building until the early 17th century. Other residents include William Henry West, a weights and scales maker, who took over the business of George Stanley, another scale maker, in 1882, and created a business with his name and address stamped on every product.
W.H. West, 41 Elm Hill, Norwich.
Amazing.
And so the smaller ones were also made here?
Yes, some of them were. These are what they call cut plates, where one inserts into the other.
It is now Elm Hill Collectibles, run by Paul and Anne, who kindly allowed me to peek below in the cellars, where I discovered the original late 19th century furnace and huge bellows that William West would have used in the creation of these brass and iron weights. The old wooden beams still bearing the scars of fires that raged a little too close for comfort. They would not have wanted a repeat of 1507.
The crumbling bellows are, of course, well past their use-by date, but it is another reminder of the rich variety of trades that once flourished on this most famous of Norwich streets.
About half of the blue plaques in our city centre concern buildings. Well-known ones such as here, the Bell Hotel, or the former Roman Catholic Chapel of St John, now known as the Madder Market Theatre.
Not all of the blue plaques refer to buildings that are in existence today. Here on St Giles was the wonderful Hippodrome Theatre, where artists such as Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy, Gracie Fields, the Goons, Morecambe and Wise, they all once appeared. And now it's a multi-storey car park.
Or the Anglo-Saxon built St Christopher's Church on Princes Street, destroyed by fire in the mid-13th century. Or the Corn Exchange that sat on the corner of Bedford Street and Exchange Street, seen here in 1938. It closed in 1963, was subsequently demolished, with an extension to Gerald's department store being built in its place. There's been a nonconformist church on this site in Princes Street for almost 200 years. The foundation stone for the first was laid in March 1819. By the 1860s, the chapel was considered inadequate, so it was demolished, and for just under £3,000, a new one was built.
So Nick, tell me about why this church was built here on Princes Street.
Well, by the 1860s, the existing church was full to overflowing. Nonconformity was very strong in 19th century Norwich, and they wanted a church that could accommodate an increasing congregation and also provide space for all the educational work that they did.
So who was responsible for galvanising the local congregation to get this building created?
It was John Alexander. John Alexander was a congregational clergyman, and in 9 months he not only raised the money but got the church built, and also used some of his own money to do so.
In the Middle Ages, Timber Hill was the location for selling swine, and then timber brought in from the countryside. It was known as Swine Market Hill, which became Timber Market Hill, and that developed into Timber Hill. And it too has its fair share of blue plaques.
At the bottom end of Orford Hill is George Walpole, grandson of Robert Walpole, our first Prime Minister. He was renowned for his idiosyncratic behaviour and the extravagant spending which brought the family estate at Houghton to ruin. This popular restaurant is actually located in a former warehouse converted by the particular Baptists congregation to a chapel in 1832. Further up is a plaque to Norwich's first Jewish Lord Mayor, Arthur Samuel. Arthur gave generously during his mayoral year, including paying for 30 families made destitute by the 1912 floods to emigrate to Canada. And at the top is 33 Timber Hill, a late 17th century building, providing an example of how this street would have appeared 300 years ago.
Timber Market was at the top of the hill, more or less where John Lewis is.
Right.
But of course the market's extended right across the centre of the city. For a long time into the 19th century, it was a public house, but it also doubled as a brothel. In 19th century Norwich, quite a few of the city's public houses, and at one time there were over 600, were also brothels. This was compounded by the fact that the brewers who ran them were also on the licensing committee, so many complaints did not get dealt with. So I suppose you could say that in the case of pubs like this, the landlord not only pulled pints, but I'll leave the rest to you.
And finally, a blue plaque for a building that is there but isn't actually visible. 25 Red Lion Street has a fond place in the memories of many local people who can remember the 1960s music scene in the city. There had been a pub there for many decades, and the Orford Arms was there until 1974. It was a typical city centre public house, but its real attraction was its cellar. Tucked away behind the pub, it was a venue for soul and rock music and featured some of the famous names of the time: Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Deep Purple, David Bowie, the Moody Blues, Fleetwood Mac, and many, many local bands. It was small and smoky, sweaty when full, and virtually impossible to get across the room with a drink without spilling it. Not all the plaques celebrate lives or buildings. The Norwich Post, the first provincial newspaper published in 1701, is mentioned in one on the corner of Castle Street and London Street.
These blue plaques add a layer of richness to the appreciation of our immensely rich heritage city, and I suspect add to the perception of many people who otherwise would have just passed on by. I hope you'll take the opportunity to explore them more soon.
Plaques in Norwich aren't a new invention. In a variety of forms, they've existed for some decades. In the 1970s, Norwich City Council produced a standardised green plaque scheme. This produced over 100 plaques covering an array of people, events and buildings as an immediate, high-impact initiative. In 2005, the City Council asked Hart, the Heritage Economic and Regeneration Trust, to take over the signing on its behalf. Nick Williams worked with its chief executive Mike Loveday on the subsequent book, which tells us all about the 39 plaques.
So how long did it take you to put the book together?
Probably about 18 months or so, because I started out doing the basic research, and once I'd got some of it done, I started writing it, so I didn't end up with a mass of stuff that I then had to try and absorb.
Yes.
The areas covered were the area we're in at the moment, the Cathedral Quarter and Elm Hill, the lanes, and also the area around the castle and Timber Hill. And they were picked because they're the most interesting parts of the city and provided plenty of opportunities for places to have blue plaques. It would have been nice to replace all of them, but there were about 100, so that was impractical. But we think we've done a pretty good job with the 39 blue plaques.
17 of the plaques refer to individuals, some covered in my series of Norwich firsts. There's Elizabeth Fry. Her blue plaque is on the wall of the Friends Meeting House in Uppergoat Lane, where she worshipped, on which also appears her brother-in-law, Thomas Fowle Buxton, whose plaque adorns the wall next to Elizabeth.
Another local man who's got his own blue plaque is Beeston-born Jem Mace, who ran the White Swan pub right here on Swan Lane, and later became world heavyweight boxing champion in 1870.
Jem combined his pugilistic activities with being a pub landlord in various towns, whilst also appearing in travelling circuses, including that of Pablo Fanck, who in turn is celebrated with a plaque on the walls of John Lewis. Fanck developed from an apprentice in a travelling show to become Britain's first black circus proprietor. As I said earlier, there are a multitude of signs around the city. The blue plaques are just one element of a scheme celebrating the special character of particular areas of Norwich. There are pavement markers, street nameplates explaining the reason behind historic street names, simple signs showing a birthplace or a former location of a theatre, or showing us where the old city walls stood.
Behind each is a story to surprise, or maybe just a nugget of previously unknown information. This, for example, the Norfolk and Norwich Subscription Library. It is without doubt a great thing for us all in Norwich to celebrate our pride in our identity and local distinctiveness.